Welcome to Nature Revisited, a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. And thank you for joining me for this episode with Mark J. Easter, The Blue Plate, a food lover's guide to climate chaos. Mark Easter is an ecologist and Colorado State University researcher who in his new book, The Blue Plate, details the impact that the foods we eat have on the planet. The Blue Plate is not a cookbook, but rather it examines our relationship to food through the lens of the climate crisis. Mark shares with us stories of these foods, from the soil to the farmer, from the grocer to the table. Each chapter describes their social and environmental impact, as well as their greenhouse emissions. Mark joins me from his home in Fort Collins, Colorado, to help us further understand what's really for dinner. So Mark, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast, talking about your new book, The Blue Plate. So let's start with, when did you first start thinking about writing The Blue Plate, and why?
Hey, Stefan. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with you. My idea to start the book really began with a conversation I had with my colleague, Sue Ellen Campbell at Colorado State University. She's an expert in environmental writing and climate communication. She and I were walking across the campus one day, and we were discussing a really recent, really important paper that had come out about climate change. This was quite a while ago. The science in the paper was solid. It was excellent. The scientists writing the paper had done a good job of communicating the science within the context of the scientific community. We were well versed at talking to each other within the scientific community, but they had just completely failed in their attempt to try to communicate what the science meant to the public and to policymakers. They're using jargon and all this science geek speak. Nobody outside the scientific community really understood what the heck they were talking about. So Ellen looked at me at one point and she said, "You scientists, you guys just screw this up every chance you get." And she was right. There was a long period where the scientific community was not doing a good job explaining what was going on within the science around climate change to the general public in a way that the public understood. And I really took that to heart. I realized that was especially true in my own field. I'm an ecologist and a greenhouse gas accountant studying agriculture and how we grow food and process and ship and distribute it, and also cooking it and dealing with the leftovers and trying to understand what the consequences for the climate were from all of that. The general public, I think, was starting to get a good understanding of what happens when you burn stuff, especially fossil fuels, how that creates pollution and how the emissions could warm the climate. There wasn't a good understanding about how it changes in the way we grow crops, what we described generically as land use, either for agriculture or for forestry or for where we build houses and where we don't, those sorts of things, how we manage rivers, how those sorts of things could actually create significant carbon emissions. And it turns out they do. The way we utilize the land can generate really large carbon emissions. And in total, the food system was producing a quarter of the human-caused greenhouse gas emissions that were contributing to climate change. I realized that we needed to step up to the plate and try to communicate that well, because it was such a significant chunk of the human-caused climate emissions worldwide. But also there were good things that could be done about it. And unless the general public understood that it was going to be hard to enable the public to make good decisions about food choices and other things that could help enable reductions in those emissions and potentially reversing some of them.
So what is regenerative farming, and how does it relate to a healthy soil?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It really cuts to the core of this. Regenerative farming, as described to me by a farmer that I profile in my book, The Blue Plate, he described it as this. He said it all comes down to carbon in the soil. What he had found was that if he focused on increasing the organic matter and the carbon associated with that in his soil, that there were so many other benefits that came from that. It improved all these different aspects of the soil that we generically refer to as soil health, in a way that helped him to stabilize his crop yields, help him to capture more snowmelt and rainfall, and also store that moisture in the soil in a way that his crops could utilize it. The crop yields actually increased, and he saw less variability from year to year that came with that. He saw a lot more life in the soil in the form of earthworms and other soil organisms, insects, all kinds of other solid indicators that there was life in the soil was functioning more effectively and supporting his objectives as a farmer.
What is soil carbon debt, and how important is it that we repay it?
I think this was one of the most interesting findings that came out of the scientific community in the last decade. This idea of soil carbon debt was coined by my colleague John Sanderman at the Woodville Climate Institute. John and his colleagues had asked the question, how much carbon have we lost from the soil due to agriculture? And they defined agriculture as clearing land, plowing soil to raise crops, but also clearing forests to create grasslands to raise livestock, and also grazing livestock on existing grasslands that never had forests on them to begin with. What we've learned through a number of different scientific studies is that when you do these sorts of things, when you clear forests or plow grasslands in order to raise crops, or you introduce livestock and replace wildlife like bison and elk, that it has implications for the organic matter in the soil, that it tends to decrease. And in some cases, it can decrease significantly. Some of the practices are so damaging that it can actually cut the soil organic carbon stocks in half, reducing the organic matter so significantly. It turns out that the carbon in the soil, we refer to it as a pool of carbon. It's the largest storehouse of carbon on the planet outside of the deep oceans. Almost twice as much carbon in the Earth's soil, what we refer to as the excited skin of the planet, than there is in the atmosphere. That discovery, that finding, and John's research, he found that through time, over the last 12,000 years, basically since agriculture first started to be practiced, that we had lost a lot of that carbon that was in the soil. It was equal to about half of the carbon emissions that have come from burning fossil fuels since the beginning of the industrial age in the late 1880s. And that term debt, I think, was a good word to apply to that, because debt implies something that can and must be repaid. What we found through scientific research is that it actually can be repaid through reforestation, through changing the way that we grow crops, that actually can increase some of that organic matter in the soil. We can restore some of that carbon that was lost historically from agriculture, and in the process improve soil health. through these regenerative agriculture methods.
So, what is the connection between microbes and soil carbon?
I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of all of this, is that microbes are at the center of all of this. Whereas fossil fuels do get burned in agriculture to pull implements to the field, to plant crops, to harvest them, and then obviously to transport crops and to remanufacture them into food items like bread and crackers, tomato sauce. The majority of the emissions that come from what we call the food system actually come from microbes in the soil, microbes in the guts of animals, microbes in the depth of landfills. The story involved with soil, I think, is one of the most fascinating aspects of it, because microbes and their other colleagues within the soil, earthworms and insects and other organisms down there, they work in concert with plants to actually capture the organic matter that the plants fix through photosynthesis. They chemically attach that carbon to clay and silt particles in the soil. They're the main actors building up that gigantic storehouse of carbon in the soil, what my colleague Francesca Catrufo describes the soil carbon vault. But interestingly, depending on how soil is managed, if soil is grazed too heavily or it's disturbed, it's plowed too heavily, it actually can break open that vault and make the organic matter that's stored there more available to other microbes in the soil that can then decompose it, use it as food. And that reverses that storehouse, essentially turns it into carbon dioxide, releases it back to the atmosphere where it heats the climate. It's interesting to me that microbes had that role in capturing the carbon, holding it in the soil, but then equally important, have a role of releasing it to the soil depending on how crops are grown.
In the book, you examine how the basic foods that we eat have different effects on the environment and climate warming. Can we take a look at a few of them, starting with grains?
This is one of the most interesting aspects of the story of the carbon footprint, because more land is used to grow grains worldwide than any other crop. And wherever agriculture is practiced, there are grains that are being grown there. As it turns out, the research shows that changing the way we grow grains has the potential for capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in the soil more effectively than almost any other crop. And so there's the potential there to reverse some of the carbon dioxide emissions and offset emissions both from fossil fuels, but also from other aspects of agriculture. Not all of them, but to a significant degree, through the growing of grains, can really blunt the sharpest edges of the climate crisis.
And secondly, how about corn?
Most interesting aspects of corn is that there's more corn grown on land than almost any other single crop, short of wheat. More nitrogen fertilizer applied to corn than almost any other crop in the world. And that has a major story because the way corn is fertilized worldwide tends to be problematic in a lot of cases. More fertilizer is applied to corn in excess than most other crops. And that has significant problems for water quality, or potential for it to run off and run into rivers and go into oceans where it contributes to producing dead zones. That excess application, whether it's too much or applied at the wrong time or in the wrong amount, leads to really high emissions of an important trace gas called nitrous oxide that has a really significant climate heating effect. Nitrous oxide, the same gas that we get in the dentist chair or in certain types of surgeries as an anesthetic. It's also an extremely potent greenhouse gas. On an equivalency basis, 300 times the climate warming effect as an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide on a pound per pound basis. So a little bit goes a long way. And what we've discovered is that applying fertilizers in excess or at the wrong time or timing it poorly can lead to extremely large emissions of nitrous oxide from the soil. And the microbes are at the center of this. And I think that's just one of the fascinating things. Microbes come back into this story time and time again. As the microbes take up the nitrogen that's applied in the soil, they act as intermediaries between the nitrogen fertilizer that's in the soil and the plant roots. And as they take up that nitrogen and pass it along to plants or consume it in other ways, they release nitrous oxide. So that's one of the greatest opportunities we see in reducing climate emissions from growing food, and in particular from corn and other crops that receive such large amounts of nitrogen fertilizer, and finding ways to work in concert with the microbe community in the soil and how they interact with the plants in order to reduce those emissions and also improve the soil health in a way that plants can utilize those nutrients a lot more efficiently and effectively.
And then there is meat, which you say in the book presents the most difficult to reduce their carbon footprint.
Yes, and that's something where there's a lively and I think really important debate going on between the public and the scientific community and internally among scientists. The largest emissions from meat come from ruminants, animals that have this thing that are called a rumen, and that is beef, sheep, goat, and others. But within the U.S., it's principally beef and lamb where the greatest emissions come. The reason for this is because of this long, well-established symbiotic relationship that these ruminants have with microbes in their guts. Fascinating that microbes play such a significant role here again. The foods that cattle and sheep eat are not easily digestible just on their own. There's a lot of cellulose and carbohydrates, other really complex sugars in the plants that just on their own, the cattle and sheep have not evolved ways to digest those. But a relationship with microbes in their guts, in what they're called the rumen, or that's the very first of multiple stomachs. And so they consume the plants, send them into their rumen where it sits for a significant amount of time, and the microbes have their way with the plant matter in their rumen. The microbes are able to consume those sugars in a way that the cattle and the sheep could not, in a way that actually produces methane as a byproduct. Methane is another trace gas where a little bit just goes a long way. Methane has a climate warming effect that is up to over 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide on a pound for pound basis. There are some good solutions out there that can help reduce those methane emissions, but it's difficult to see how they can be avoided completely, especially since we're considering this symbiotic relationship that literally goes back to the dinosaurs. It's an area of really active scientific investigation, and there's a lot of attention being paid to it. People are trying to find ways to utilize additives in a way that reduces those methane emissions without affecting how productive the plants are, how much meat they can build up, how much biomass they can build, or how much milk they can produce. So it's something we need to pay a lot of attention to, but at the present time, it's really hard to avoid those methane emissions.
And of course, America is quite a large meat consumer.
Yes, all the developed nations are. And as developing nations become more affluent, as people build wealth and their life improve, meat is a desirable food product. People tend to consume more meat as they become more affluent. I think that's one of the most interesting challenges that we face, is because there is so much meat being consumed, and there are so many other environmental consequences besides the methane emission to come from raising livestock. Forests get cleared in order to create pasture. Whenever forests get cleared, the carbon and the nitrogen that's in those forests, it's in the tree trunks and the leaves and in the soil, frequently get decomposed or they get burned. And as a result, you have carbon dioxide and trace gases, nitrous oxide and methane that can go into the atmosphere because of that and continue to warm the climate. When forests are cleared and then plowed to create croplands, say to grow soybeans, to feed livestock, there's the emissions associated with that as well, too. The scientific community has pretty clearly established that we're at a point now where we can no longer continue to clear forests. I'll say this a little bit differently. We need to have stopped deforesting decades ago. We actually need to reverse that process and reforest and build up the forest lands within the world. At the same time, there's this challenge of continuing to produce the crops that we need in order to feed a growing world population. It's a difficult concept to balance when we need to be reducing climate heating emissions.
In the book, you talk about composting. Simply put, why compost?
I think this is one of the places where individual consumers can play such a significant role. What we found in the scientific community, and also policymakers have found the same thing, and state and federal agencies have discovered that if we can divert our food waste from the landfills, we can avoid major climate heating emissions, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. When our food waste goes into the trash and then ends up in landfills, it gets buried deep under the soil. Just like within the guts of animals, we see the same thing going on in lagoons, manure lagoons, where manure gets stored. The oxygen in those systems is very quickly used up, and there's still microbes down there. Microbes, there they are again. The microbes consume that organic matter and they produce methane as a waste product. That methane comes to the surface. And even though there are attempts to capture that methane in many landfills around the world, it's not very efficient, is what the science is starting to show. What's way more effective is diverting all of it, the food waste, the yard waste, keep it from going into the landfills in the first place, put it into compost programs where it can be converted into compost, and it's turned out to be an extremely effective and useful amendment to croplands and to pasture lands. We're feeding the microbe community within the soil in a way that's very effective, healthier crops, all these other benefits that get added on top of this. Besides avoiding the methane emissions, you reduce the need for chemical fertilizers, and you can also facilitate other processes that can lead to the buildup of more organic matter in the soil, increasing what's called carbon sequestration, or pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, drawing it down and storing it into the soil. It's literally the same as choosing to not drive your car, not burning gasoline, combining trips or carpooling, or being able to walk or ride your bicycle to go run errands as opposed to burning gasoline in your automobile. You get the same benefit from not throwing your food waste and yard waste into the trash, but actually diverting it into a composting program.
So it seems like that more and more it really comes down to the choices that we make about our food. How do you make your choices when it comes to choosing your food?
Yeah, I so appreciate that question. And my choices have evolved over the process of doing the research for this book, meeting with farmers around the country and around the world, not just farmers, but ranchers and also extension specialists, people involved in industry associated with farming. And choice does play a significant role because there's a feedback loop between individual consumers and foods that are made available to them. If individuals are requesting or even demanding different food choices, the markets tend to respond. But also when we speak out to policymakers, to our elected officials, and when we talk about these sorts of things in podcasts like this and letters to the editor and in our larger community, people start to pay attention to these sorts of things. I've moved towards a largely plant-based diet over the development of this book, out of concern not just for greenhouse gas emissions, but mostly the other sorts of issues that are raised in confined animal feeding operations. So I no longer purchase meat that come out of those sorts of systems. Climate benefits are not as clear from making that choice, but there's so many other benefits that come from it. I've moved largely to a plant-based diet, partially because I've discovered that it's more satisfying and more nutritious. The health benefits for me are very significant. At the same time, the planetary benefits from the standpoint of reducing the impacts of the climate crisis are more significant. We find that in the case of red meat like beef and lamb, that the emissions associated with producing a pound of that product are much, much higher than they are comparable plant-based foods. There are other animal protein choices that are out there that produce less emissions. For example, I was really surprised to learn this in researching the book, but farmed shellfish have a carbon footprint that's comparable to or less than sources of plant-based proteins. At the same time, though, we do find that we can't necessarily grow wheat and beans and soybeans and tomatoes and other plant-based foods everywhere. In fact, in many parts of the world, including in the U.S., it would be an environmental disaster and a climate disaster to try to grow crops in those areas because the soils couldn't sustain it. The climate is not appropriate for it. The slopes are too steep or rocky. The best form of agriculture that we see is raising livestock in those places. We need to examine that very carefully and where we can raise livestock in a way that's compatible with other needs like protecting watersheds and protecting biodiversity and making sure that land is compatible with wildlife. Those are appropriate forms of agriculture that need to continue. And there's literally hundreds of millions of acres around the world where that is the case.
Besides reading your book, how can people become better consumers when it comes to buying the food we eat?
I so appreciate that. And I try to summarize this in the book with just a few simple concepts. Michael Pollan provided this wonderful dictum in his book, He said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And I think that summarizes it pretty well. For meat eaters, consider pastured poultry and regeneratively grown grazing animals and dairy products, as well as the farmed shellfish that I mentioned. There are significant climate benefits from that. Poultry tends to have much lower carbon emissions compared with red meat. Pasture-raised poultry has the potential to reduce those emissions even further. And we mentioned composting. Keeping your food and yard waste out of the landfill has a really significant reductions on an individual basis that people can feel really good about. And then finally, there are verified labeling systems that are starting to show up. Buy foods that are certified under those labels, where you see them on your vegetables or on canned foods or frozen foods or whatever, any kind of packaged goods. Look for those sorts of labels that are pointing to verifiable actual carbon emissions to produce the foods in those goods.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mark Easter and that you get the opportunity to read this very important book, The Blue Plate. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan, and I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.